Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to the Sagas of Swamp Thing podcast. Today we are reading issue 24 of Swamp Thing Volume 1, which is the final issue of this volume, so it's kind of a milestone. We finally reached it. After this, we will continue into the 80s Swamp Thing, which is Volume 2, which I think everybody knows is the good stuff. That's the one with Alan Moore and whatnot, but I believe the first 18 issues are actually by Martin Pasco, and then it becomes the Alan Moore run. So just a little catch-up before we get into issue 24. In the last issue, we saw two new villains. One is a human named Sabre, and the other is this big, giant yellow guy known as Thrudvang. And they are after Swamp Thing, obviously, because of his biorestorative formula. And they are working for a group of bad guys known as Colossus. And Colossus is the ones, I guess, who want the formula. Now, Swamp Thing has gone back to, I believe it's Washington in the northwest of America. And that is where his family is from, actually. And he went to his old house, and what he found there was his brother that we didn't know he had. His brother's name is Edward Holland, and it just so happens that Edward Holland is a world-renowned chemist. So he and his assistant named Ruth developed a cure for Swamp Thing so that he could be human again. And right as they were testing the new cure on Swamp Thing, that is when Sabre decided to attack. But unlucky for Sabre, part of this cure involved exploding the lab, because basically they just have to do the same thing that turned Alec into Swamp Thing in order to turn him back to Alec. So they recreate the explosion, they have a pool of water with the specific water chemistry and pH that was in the swamp at the time that he became Swamp Thing. So as the explosion happens, Swamp Thing does what he's supposed to do. He runs out of the building, covered in chemicals, goes into this pool with the swamp water, and that's where he runs into Sabre. And him and Sabre have a big fight, and as Swamp Thing is fighting him, all of a sudden he begins to turn back into Alec Holland, and they actually wrestle each other into the flames of the burning barn, which of course collapses on them, and it looks like Sabre is either dead or he's got some really, really bad burns, because it basically showed his whole body melting, but it seemed like the flames actually helped Swamp Thing because he stood up in the middle of them, and he fully transformed back into Alec, and that is where we left off on the last issue with him cured of being Swamp Thing and looking like human Alec again. So first things first, with issue 24, we got the cover. We see a big fight between Swamp Thing and Thrudvang, and in the background we see Edward holding a passed out Ruth in his hands as he watches this fight, and there is a burning car behind them as well. And as Thrudvang punches Swamp Thing, he says, "Tell me your secret, Swamp Thing. Tell me or die." There's also a little box for the potential readers passing by who is saying, "You'll never forgive yourself if you miss the mystery of Alec Holland." Oh, you know what? Actually, I'm wrong. That's not Edward holding Ruth. It's Alec, because this box has a big arrow pointing to him. So I guess they're alluding to he is the mystery of Alec Holland. And I'm just putting this together, and it is very mysterious because we have Thrudvang punching Swamp Thing, but in the background, if we have Alec Holland, then who's Swamp Thing? I guess we'll have to find out. So as we turn to the first page, we see the name of this issue is The Earth Below, and it is written by David Anthony Kraft, with art by Ernie Chua and Fred Carrillo. And on this first page, we get a little bit of a recap of what happened in the last issue. We see Swamp Thing running towards us on fire, and in the background, we get little flashes of Sabre and Ruth, and then we get some narration that says, "Pain Fire, alive and avaricious, attacking Swamp Thing with searing, blistering intensity. Pain Fire, consuming him simultaneously from within, feeding on his tortured soul." Then we turn the page and we see this fiery Swamp Thing is running from a bunch of hands that are grabbing out at him, and he's thinking, "Gotta escape, but where am I running to? No place to go." Then the narration says, "That is unfortunately the truth of it. There is no escape from destiny." And then Swamp Thing yells out, "Lord, why me? Why?" And as he screams on fire, the narration continues saying, "No escape, not even in sleep." And then we see some hands reach out, and a woman says, "Alec, wake up! You're all right! You're not that shambling Swamp Thing anymore." And then we see Ruth standing by Alec Holland's bed, and she is shaking him, and as he comes to, she continues saying, "You're human again, and you have new life. That is, if you can ever forget the past." And as Alec sits up, he says, "Ruth, I'm sorry. That nightmare was so vivid and so true." Those memories are etched into my soul, Ruth. I can't pretend they didn't happen. And I can't forget that my wife is dead. And Ruth says, It's my turn to be sorry, Alec. I wasn't asking you to forget Linda. I only meant that you can't change the past. You can just accept it and try to keep going. And then Alec stands up and says, I know. And you're right, Ruth. It's been so long since I've been human that I can't help having doubts. And Ruth asks, What kind of doubts, Alec? And Alec answers, After all the agony, confusion, and inner turmoil I've endured, can I ever adjust to being a man again? And then he stares at himself in a mirror and says, And what if I can't? The idea of a new life scares me, Ruth. Where do I start? And then she walks up behind him and puts her hands on his shoulder and says, Start with me, Alec. Start with me. But it seems like he just can't get past it, so he opens a sliding door and he walks out away from Ruth. And over these panels, the narration says, There are no words then, just the caress of a slight breeze gentling down the nighted mountainside, as Dr. Alec Holland steps silently out into the cool, moist Oregon air to clear his troubled head, and perhaps to consider the meaning of Ruth Monroe's offer. Then we cut to the next day, and there's a big building, I'm not sure what it is, but there's a narration text box that says, Quinn, Oregon, a quiet oasis of education high in the Blue Mountains, midway between the high country desert and the lush Willamette Valley. And from the outside we hear someone say, Sheriff, I'm here to take charge of a man known as Sabre. And the sheriff replies, It sure beats me how you got word so soon, especially since he's only been locked up overnight. Then we cut to the inside of the building and we see the sheriff is talking to someone who is wearing a suit. And he continues saying, But your credentials are in order, Mr. Solomon Smith. And if you say the feds want this Sabre guy, then I guess he's all yours. Mr. Smith replies, Thank you, Sheriff Klein. He was under my surveillance, just in case he messed up. And he did a real bad job of that yesterday. So the sheriff walks Mr. Smith back to the holding cells, and as he does, he says, Follow me, Mr. Smith. And if you don't mind me asking, what's all this about anyway? And Mr. Smith answers, Sheriff, I'm not at liberty to reveal any details, except for my immediate orders, which are, as you already know, to secure custody of Sabre. Then we see them walk into Sabre's cell, and you might have been expecting him to be fully in like a hospital bed or something with third-degree burn bandages all over his body and like IVs and stuff, but he's sitting up on a cot. He does have bandages and his arm looks like it's in a sling and his face is completely wrapped up, but we can see most of his upper torso and it looks like most of it's not burned. So maybe his suit is made of asbestos or something. But he doesn't say anything to them as they come into his cell. And then we cut away to a video screen where we see two people watching. And these look like the guys that were giving the orders from Colossus, because they are wearing spandex suits that are covering them head to toe. One is blue and the other is red. And we see they're watching video of Swamp Thing lifting up a bunch of construction equipment and throwing it around. And over this panel, the narration says, Shortly thereafter, rare footage assembled from the persistent efforts of various news teams and from other occasional and largely accidental filmed sightings of the moss-draped marsh dweller flutters noiselessly in a darkened chamber, witnessed only by 4 ominous pairs of narrowed eyes. Then we see the man in blue say, Look closely, men, and envision an army of such soldiers, each one of them composed of slime and muck, inhumanly strong and nearly indestructible, yet with no wants or needs beyond a pathetic mindless compulsion to obey. An army of swamp soldiers at our command. And then the man in red says, In the service of Colossus. And the way the man in red was talking at first, it sounded like maybe he was addressing a room full of other soldiers or men, but he's not. He's just in the control room with the man in blue. And then we see the lawyer and Sabre come in, and Sabre looks fully healed now. He is no longer in bandages, and he is in his old suit. And both the blue and red man turn around, and the red man says, But before that army can become a reality, we must learn of the secret of the biorestorative formula, and we can only do that by capturing the Swamp Thing. You failed that task, Sabre.
failed, and had to be rescued from jail by Solomon Smith. Thus you are no longer chief enforcer, and more, next time you fail, you die.
And Sabre gets very defiant, and he strikes a pose, and he holds up his hand that's balled in a fist, and he shakes it at a Swamp Thing statue in the room, and he says, "So, my career, my honor, my right hand are not enough. Next, my life is to be forfeit to that monster. I will not fail again." Then Mr. Smith asks, "Councilman Red, what of Sabre's companion, who still remains in Oregon?" And then Councilman Blue speaks up, and he pulls out a gun, and he points it at the Swamp Thing statue and says,
"Aye, what of Thrudvang, the Earthmaster? For if this elusive Swamp Thing cannot be captured by our agents, then I am of the mind that it must be destroyed."
Then he pulls the trigger, and the Swamp Thing statue explodes, and then Councilman Red chastises him, saying,
"Do not allow your emotions to run rampant over your better judgment, Councilman Blue. The secret we seek is not death, though that is always a final recourse. As for Thrudvang, he is unpredictable."
Then we turn the page and we cut to Thrudvang walking through a wooded area, and there's a broken down logging truck, and we see some men trying to fix a flat tire, and as they're all gathered around this tire trying to change it, we get some narration from Councilman Red saying,
"He's been mute and surly since the treatments which recreated him, and this Swamp Thing mission is his first field assignment."
Then we see one of the men who's changing the tire looks up and sees Thrudvang just kind of staring at them from maybe 20 feet away, and he begins to run and he says, "Hey fellas, we got company, bad company." So as he runs away, the narration from Councilman Red continues saying,
"His disposition is unstable. He's easily antagonized, and his potential for destruction is truly immense, almost infinite."
Then the man who had the tire iron throws it at Thrudvang and he says, "Back off, damn you! Back off!" Then the man who was running away yells, "Don't hassle him, Bondo! Just get away from the truck now!" Then we see Bondo and the man who was yelling for him to run are now both running away, but the third man is just clinging to the cab of the truck. And unfortunately for him, Thrudvang picks up the entire truck and logs begin to fall off of the back of it. And this is like a semi-truck, so, I mean, he's got 30-foot logs on the back of it, and they're just tumbling down. And Councilman Red's narration continues saying,
"Unsupervised, Thrudvang may be wandering at large, and any incident at all can provoke his remorseless hostility. You've got to find him before he goes on a berserk rampage."
Then we see Thrudvang throw the entire truck towards the men who are running, and we see the third man fly off in their direction as well. Then we get some narration that says, "It's too late for that. Already, turbulent rage has replaced limited reason, escalating this random encounter into an incredible orgy of carnage and chaos. And behind those obsidian eyes, tearing savagely at the dark mind of the great Titan, is an inchoate and primal fury, seeking even more direct expression." And under that narration, we see the three men trying to dodge the logs that are flying towards them, and luckily they do, but they're all kind of huddled on the ground in one area. Then we see Thrudvang begin to focus, and these lines of, I guess, telekinetic energy come out of his head, and the narration continues saying, "Finally, he can contain it no longer, and abruptly it lashes out, twisting, rending, and exploding in violent upheaval. The power of Thrudvang, the Earth Master." Then we see the earth below the men that are huddled on the ground lift up and begin to levitate, and then a giant chasm forms below them, and Thrudvang drops all three of them in the hole. And the narration says, "Then, just as suddenly, his misspent temper takes an unusual turn. His awesome and unreasoning anger abates, and Thrudvang stands inarticulate and sadly alone. He strains dimly but intently to remember, to understand." Then we get a Thrudvang flashback, and we basically get his origin. So we see him as a man being tied down to a bed, and then we see him screaming out in pain, and the narration says, "Images burned distantly through the mindless, senseless days of his consciousness, fragmentary and fleeting memories of a fearful Bowery bum drafted by the Colossus organization and sent screaming to the mutation lab. He is an elemental now, one of their agents, and this catastrophic clash with loggers was merely a minor diversion, a prelude to a far more important mission. Thrudvang must find the Swamp Thing. Then Thrudvang begins to walk away from the hole in the ground and presumably towards wherever he thinks Swamp Thing is. Then we cut to Alec and Ruth in a car, and they're driving away from Edward's house, and Edward sees them and he stops them and says, "Good morning, Alec. Too bad you missed breakfast. But Ruth figured it was better to let you sleep. Besides, you can grab a bite when you're in town for groceries. How do you feel anyway?" And Alec answers, "Great. That was real genius, Edward. Recreating the events that made me the Swamp Thing and then reversing them? You've given me another chance at being human, and that means a lot to me. Hell, it means everything." And then Edward smiles and says, "That's what brothers are for, Alec, to help one another." Then Ruth smiles at Alec and says, "Come on, handsome. You can talk to Edward later. Right now, I want you all to myself." And then they drive away, and as they do, we see Edward looking longingly after them, and he thinks, "Alec and I have always been rivals. While he won all the research grants, government chemistry contracts, and recognition, I went completely ignored. Now he's back from the dead, and already the pattern starts anew, with Ruth. Well, it's not going to happen again, Alec. Not again." Then we cut to Alec and Ruth walking in town, and Alec is saying to her, "You know, Ruth, just being here like this erases the years since I've been gone, and makes all the incredible events in between seem unreal." And Ruth replies, "You sound wistful." And Alec says, "I am. Edward is lucky. He was content to stay in Oregon, while I felt compelled to pursue a career and abandon my past." And as they're walking, we do see that Alec has a bag of groceries in his hands. And as they get to the car, he opens the trunk and he sets it in, and she says, "But you've come back, and there's still time enough to build a new future. All it takes is courage." Right as she says that, he is finishing bending over to put the bag of groceries in the trunk, and Alec yells out in pain and grabs his lower back. And Ruth says, "Alec, what's wrong?" And as he tries to stretch it out, he says, "I had a backache, just for a second. It's nothing to worry about. It's already gone." And a worried Ruth asks, "Are you sure?" But then he doubles over in pain again, and he grabs his stomach this time, and she says, "Alec, the transformation. It must have put a serious strain on your system. I'll get you to a doctor." But Alec replies, "I'm all right, Ruth. I guess I still got some adjusting to do. That's all." And Ruth, of course, isn't buying it, and she asks, "Adjusting? You could be dying. Do you realize that?" But then Alec just stands up straight and tries to hold in the pain, and he says, "I told you, I'm all right." And Ruth says, "And I'm supposed to believe you?" And then Alec moves to the passenger side and says, "I just need a few days to rest and recuperate. That's all. Let's go home, Ruth." And a worried Ruth gets in the driver's seat and says, "Okay, Alec, if that's what you want. But I don't buy it. You're hiding something." And as Alec tries to maintain face by holding in whatever pain he's got, he thinks to himself, "She's right. I didn't want to admit it, even to myself. I wanted to pretend that I was normal again. But the last time I felt like this was as Swamp Thing, when the bioregenerative formula caused me to regrow my lost arm. Lord, what can it be doing to me now?" Then we cut to the Colossus headquarters, where we see Sabre is talking to Solomon, and he says, "Since we are to be partners, Solomon Smith, I will tell you what I did not tell them." And Mr. Smith replies, "You mean you dared to withhold information from the councilmen?" And Sabre replies, "Indeed. The Swamp Thing has reverted to his human alter ego, thus rendering himself quite vulnerable. We'll force him to talk before we destroy him, so we alone will possess his secret. Then we shall trade the formula for positions of power on the council." Then they get into an elevator, and Mr. Smith says, "You are very bold, Sabre. Very bold. What about Thrudvang? And as they exit the elevator, Sabre says, he is the hazard, Smith. I fear he'll attempt to locate the Swamp Thing in my absence, and if he gets him before we arrive, well, there's no telling what'll happen to Dr. Holland. Then we see Alec and Ruth in the car, and they're driving up a road, and we see Thrudvang is waiting for them in the woods. And the narration says, target located. The tiny tracer implanted in Alec/Swamp Thing's shoulder still transmits its steady signal, and for Thrudvang, that is enough, for he is the Earthmaster, and his arcane assault is accurate, unforeseen, and absolutely unavoidable. Then as Ruth is driving, all of a sudden, a giant mound of earth erupts in front of their car, and they crash into it. And I don't know if this car has a gas tank in the front or something, but it completely explodes, and we only see Alec Holland flying from the car. And the narration says, Ruth and Alec do not even have time to confront the reality of death before they are spared its bloody embrace and given another uncertain option on survival, a most precarious and perhaps short-lived option. Then we see Thrudvang approach Alec and raise his fist to smash, and Alec looks up and sees him and says, good lord, I've got to move! And luckily he's a quick roller, because he rolls to his side, narrowly missing the punch of Thrudvang smashing into the ground. And as he rolls, he thinks, I'm still dazed. Everything happening so fast. I don't know who this bruiser is, or why he's after me, but I do know just how I'd react if I were still the Swamp Thing. Unfortunately, I'm not, and that means this unequal battle may be my death. And while he's thinking about him being Swamp Thing and fighting Thrudvang, we do get a little flash of what that fight would look like. And of course, Swamp Thing is beating Thrudvang in a fist fight. So once Alec realizes this might be his death, he kind of freaks out and he springs into action and he jumps towards Ruth and he yells out, no! I've got to get Ruth before that awkward man mountain gets to me, or she'll become a victim too! And he's able to reach her and he picks her up, and as he examines her, he says, thank God she's only unconscious, bruised but alive. Now all that's left is escape. And just as he thinks that, we see Thrudvang push the car aside and move towards them, and as Alec tries to run, we see the earth begin to shake and shatter underneath Alec's feet, and those telepathic lines are coming from Thrudvang's head. And as Alec tries to run, he thinks, my hulking foe is big, but he's not fast. He relies instead on an uncanny ability to disrupt the earth, which I'm hoping I can outdistance quickly, since I can't carry Ruth very far. I'm still in shock from the crash, and may collapse any second. So as he's thinking this, he just begins jumping across the chasms that are forming, and he's doing a really good job dodging everything, especially holding Ruth over his shoulder. And as he runs away into some woods, he continues thinking, but if I can put enough distance between him and us before that happens, and then stay out of sight, maybe he won't be able to find us. So Alec goes to hide in the woods, but of course Alec doesn't know that there's a tracker in him, so Thrudvang begins to follow him into the woods, and the narration confirms this because it says, a reasonable and astute scheme, based on the obviously limited intellect of their adversary, and one that might have well succeeded in its desperate simplicity, if not for the telltale broadcast of the miniature homing device lodged traitorously under Dr. Alec Holland's skin. Then we cut to Alec and Ruth, and they are on a riverbank, and Alec is splashing her face with water, trying to get her to wake up. And as he does that, he thinks, time. How well I remember its sluggish passage in the swamp, making my lonely existence a wretched and endless torment of introspection. Now it mocks me, forcing me to act in haste and exhaustion. And unless I can get Ruth up on her own feet, this is the end of the line. Right here in the open. And then Alec yells, Ruth, wake up! And I guess his scream finally does the job because she does sit up and she says, what? Alec? Are you all right? And as Alec pulls on his shoulder, he says, yeah, but... Then she rushes over to him and she looks at his shoulder and she says, you're in pain. And then Alec looks down and says, that's not important, Ruth. Just listen to me. And then she looks up at him and says, no, Alec, I won't. You're not some kind of martyr. You're a man. And then she kisses him on the lips, and then she continues saying, and I won't let you suffer alone anymore. And then she kisses him on the lips again, and they embrace. But unfortunately, they hear a noise and they turn and they see Thrudvang staring at them about 4 feet away. So I guess Thrudvang is pretty light on his feet. And then Ruth sees him and screams out, "Alec!" Then the narration says, "Time. A single moment that lingers tenderly, then is gone. A brief eternity that is most rudely shattered by a sinister stalker who follows an insidious spore of radio signals." And then very quickly, Thrudvang reaches out and picks Alec up in his hands. As Alec struggles against him, he says, "Ruth, you've gotta run!" And Ruth says, "Not without you, Alec! Not without you!" And then Alec is able to break free of Thrudvang's grip, and he pushes away from him with his feet, and he yells out, "Run, damn it!" And then he takes off in the opposite direction of her, but she is unfortunately unconscious on the ground now. And he looks back to see her unconscious, and he thinks to himself, "She's frozen. The crash, now this, all this is too much for her. I feel like I'm gonna pass out, but I can't. Not yet. I have to keep going. Lead him away from her." Then luckily for him, as he's running, he comes across a rope bridge, and as he begins to cross it, he says, "I don't believe it. I've just got a flash of mad genius." And then he goes to the center of the bridge, and he pulls out a knife, and he thinks, "Although this bridge has been here since I was a kid, it's not necessarily permanent. After all, that mindless man-brute weighs half a ton if he weighs an ounce." Then we see Thrudvang get on the bridge and begin to move towards Alec, and Alec begins to cut the rope in the center, very reminiscent of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And he continues thinking, "And when I'm finished, that may just be enough to send this structure, and him, plunging to the bottom of the Mackenzie River Gorge. If not, I'm a goner." And as Alec continues furiously cutting with his little knife, I guess maybe it's dull or something because he's having a hard time cutting through those ropes, and we see Thrudvang approaching ever closer, and Alec says, "Lord, he's here, but I'm not ready yet. I'm a dead man." But luckily for him, the rope gives right as he says that, and the whole bridge breaks apart, and we see Thrudvang fall down into the gorge, and the narration says, "Thrudvang the Earthmaster screams then, a terrible and haunting bellow of inarticulate despair that tears his swollen throat muscles, and fades abjectly into nothingness." Then we see Alec, having climbed up the rope bridge, is now standing looking down into the gorge as Ruth clings onto him, and the narration continues saying, "The survivor stands silent, for there is time again to live, and that is enough." And as Alec and Ruth embrace, Alec thinks, "I don't even know what this was all about. That's the eerie truth, and it scares me. Maybe I should have stayed in solitude as the Swamp Thing, instead of seeking a cure and bringing yet others under the shadow of my dark destiny. Today we came through alive, but what about next time? What about next time?" And that, my friends, is the end of the issue, and I will say in the bottom of this page, it says next issue, Hawkman vs. Swamp Thing, and Portland, Oregon will never be the same. But unfortunately, that issue never happened because Swamp Thing was canceled. But have no fear, it returns 6 years later in 1982, and we will be starting Volume 2 of Swamp Thing on the next episode. So join us for that, and if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And until next time, remember to stay swampy.